The post-colonial period and accompanying post-colonial discourse has overturned some of the earlier colonial myths, such as the long-held belief that colonialism was a mostly positive and fruitful endeavor that bettered the lives of their colonial subjects. We now know that colonialism was an oppressive system that could often manifest itself in brutally violent ways. However, some old ideas are persistent. In the Anglophone world, the idea still persists that the British Empire, while responsible for a lot of suffering, still differed in fundamental ways from other colonial empires at the time. While the British Empire may not have had the best moral track record, it was at least devoid of the brutal barbarisms that were so emblematic of, for instance, the French and Belgian types of colonial rule. If you were going to be colonized, it was best you ended up as a British colony. This form of self-indulgent colonial apologism is, however, undeserved. It is true that British colonies differed and some colonies faced less violent forms of colonial rule than others. But the idea that the British did not cut off limbs or commit large-scale massacres is simply a lie. British rule could be excessively violent, and in no place was this more obvious than in Australia. In this video, we will explain the horrifying effects of colonialism on the native populations of Australia and Tasmania. Genocide, slavery, mutilation, and more. Let us start with the ancient history of Australia. Australia, its adjacent island of Tasmania, and numerous smaller islands have been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. The people who first set foot in this land were the people that would later become known as the Australian Aboriginal peoples. They consisted of a wide variety of different tribes and communities, each with their own languages and traditions. The number of native Australians that lived in Australia right before the arrival of the British is debated, but recent research suggests it would most likely have been around 800,000 people in total. Their numbers plummeted drastically during the usurpation of their lands by the British, and by the end of the 19th century, less than 100,000 remained, which meant a population decline close to a staggering 90%. When confronted with this number, colonial apologists invariably point to the fact that a large part of the population decline can be attributed to widespread disease. The natives often had little immunity to the diseases brought upon them by the Anglo-Saxon newcomers. But the truth is more complex and a lot more cruel. First of all, disease was not the only cause of the native population collapse. When the British arrived, they craved lands to settle. To the anger of the Aboriginal peoples, the British generally did not ask for permission and used the resources and land for their new settlements, which triggered resistance in several of the Aboriginal tribes they encountered. According to Aboriginal law, land was for communal use, but the settlers claimed they had an exclusive right to the lands and the fauna and flora on it. At first, most of the British settlers were male. When they fought the natives, not only had they little qualms about slaughtering entire families, but often took native women hostage, who were locked up and used as sex slaves for the male settlers. As the settlers further encroached on native lands, the fights became more intense. Settlers drove off Aboriginal communities, and Aboriginals started burning down farms, stealing crops, or killing cattle. While some of these killings were based on the misunderstanding that animals on the land, including the cattle, were for communal use, other acts of destruction were meant to scare off the increasing number of settlers, including increasing numbers of whole families that started claiming more and more land. An important characteristic of these conquests, called the Frontier Wars, were the widespread massacres of native Australians. While the natives managed to kill some of the settlers, the overwhelming amount of deaths during the Frontier Wars were Aboriginal men, women, and children. Often reprisals for real or even made-up attacks by natives on settler farms. These killings could be exceptionally brutal. In some parts of Australia, the local governors even allowed to shoot and kill any Aboriginal on sight. The following is an excerpt from a first-hand account of one of these massacres from the book Massacres to Mining by Jan Roberts. My mother would sit and cry and tell me this. They buried our babies in the ground with only their heads above the ground. All in a row they were. Then they had tests to see who could kick the baby's head off the furthest. One man clubbed a baby's head off from horseback. They then spent the rest of the day raping the women, most of whom were then tortured to death by sticking sharp things like spears up their vaginas till they died. They tied the men's hands behind their backs, then cut off their penis and testicles and watched them run around screaming until they died. They killed in other bad ways too. The settlers also used other methods to kill native Australians. For instance, in 1914, a group of native men who were accused of killing a young male cow in Kimberley were taken to a nearby station, where they were ordered to chop wood in a remote area. After finishing the task, all the men were poisoned with strychnine and left to die a painful death. In another instance in the 1890s, a convicted group of native men were chained up and taken out of town. Along the way, it was decided the group would camp for the night. In their neck chains, they were sent out to gather firewood. When they brought the firewood back, the perpetrators poured kerosene or some other fuel on the fire and threw the Aboriginal people into it, letting them burn to death. It is still debated how many natives were murdered during the bloody frontier wars that raged across Australia until the early 20th century, but recent research shows that the number may be as high as 100,000. The rest of the population crash can be explained by a combination of disease, starvation, and exposure. But even these factors were inextricably linked to the intentional killings of the Aboriginals. In several parts of Australia, hunting groups of settlers were founded, tasked with drive away local communities. These Aboriginal groups, relentlessly chased around the lands, became exhausted due to the lack of sleep, food, and water. This, together with them being driven into the territories of other tribes, caused disease to spread quickly amongst the weary and despondent Aboriginal communities. When people were caught, they could be killed or imprisoned, but the colonial settlers also had other, more lucrative uses for them. Even though the British Empire had officially forbidden the slave trade, or perhaps because of it, a lucrative slave trade emerged in late 19th century Australia. Aboriginal slaves were used on cotton plantations, but also used to herd cattle in the Northern Territories. The slaves could be recruited from native prisoners, but native children were also stolen from their mothers under the pretext of preventing child abuse, and were often used as house slaves. The enslaved Aboriginals often received no wage, were not allowed to refuse work or leave the premises on threat of violence. Not only were mainland Aboriginals enslaved, but Australian ships even sailed to nearby Melanesian islands to secretly kidnap locals and force them into slavery on Australian plantations, a practice known as blackbirding. The slavery was so flagrant, word of it even reached the Parliament in London, and Dr. Walter Edmund Roth, who had been the chief protector of the Aborigines in Queensland, was called to Western Australia in August 1904 to work for the Royal Commission on the Condition of the Natives, which investigated the treatment of Aboriginal people in the state. Roth published his findings, commonly known as the Roth Report, in late January 1905. Nevertheless, forms of slavery persisted, in some instances even until the 1970s. The debate whether the actions of the British Empire and later the Australian government constitute genocide is still debated. Some instances in particular have been called genocidal. For instance, in Queensland, where the massacres were most extreme, historians argue that acts of genocide have been committed, as certain slaughters were aimed at the complete annihilation and expulsion of specific Aboriginal tribes. Another notable example is the Tasmanian Black War. The island of Tasman was populated by around 7,000 native Tasmanians. The brutal and systemic campaign of slaughter and expulsion perpetrated by the invading settlers and sanctioned by the colonial government led to the complete extinction of all full-blooded Tasmanians. While modern historians debate to what extent the extermination campaigns in Tasmania would meet the legal conditions of genocide, the author of the concept of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, considered Tasmania the site of one of the world's clear cases of genocide. The last example we will discuss is a policy that was not grounded in the physical extermination of the native peoples, but on their cultural and genetic destruction. In 1901, the 6 British colonies that together encompassed the Australian landmass were merged into one semi-independent nation, the Commonwealth of Australia. It is important to note that complete sovereignty in Australia was achieved in steps, and only in 1986 did the British Parliament end any and all British role in the government of the Australian states. Both during the end of the colonial era and into the 20th century, sometimes even until the 1970s, did the Australian government enact a policy of forced child removal in Aboriginal areas. The children they targeted were children of mixed heritage who were the offspring of native women and settler men, who had often sexually forced themselves upon the native women. While the children were taken away under the guise of protecting them from neglect and abuse, the real reasons were considerably darker. The colonial government wanted to breed out color in the Aboriginal communities. The mixed-race children would receive an Anglo-Saxon upbringing, devoid of their cultural heritage. The government hoped that these children would marry white Australians, leading to further dilution of their native heritage until there was none left. These policies were supported by eugenicists like A.O. Neville. He once stated, "Are we going to have a population of 1 million blacks in the Commonwealth? Or are we going to merge them into our white community and eventually forget that there ever were any Aborigines in Australia?" The children who were the victims of these policies are referred to as the stolen generations. Many of the children ended up in missions, government institutions, or children's homes where living conditions were often poor. The children were often poorly fed and clothed and subjected to severe physical and even sexual abuse. But the children who remained with their native parents were not spared from the assimilation policies. In many schools, children were punished for speaking their native language. Additional restrictions were placed on movement, marriage, employment, and the practice of traditional ceremonies and legal systems by the Australian government. Some historians have argued this falls under the category of cultural genocide, where policies are aimed at destroying a people by erasing their cultural identity, which among others consists of their languages, religious beliefs, history, traditions, and customs. And while many of the destructive policies that uprooted Aboriginal culture have ended, more insidious discrimination still exists. Aboriginals have less access to health care, especially in the more remote communities, as well as access to sanitary facilities. They suffer poor health, are overrepresented in prison, significantly poorer, and have a severely reduced life expectancy. They also face police violence and are overrepresented in deaths in custody. And although the child removal policies are officially ended, Aboriginal communities have more recently been victim of governmental interventions that eerily resembled the historical injustices. But that would be a topic for another video. Hopefully this video has made it clear that British colonialism could be just as depraved and sadistic as the colonial acts of other contemporary empires. For more information about colonial history, British and otherwise, check out some of the other videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.